As we speak, an American city has been militarized over the objections of their governor. At the outset, I just want to say that this is a flagrant abuse of power and nothing short of an assault on our American values.
Well, that was New York Governor Kathy Hochul talking about the deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles in a hearing about sanctuary cities on Capitol Hill today. President Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth deployed more than 4,000 National Guard and 700 Marines to help keep federal buildings and personnel safe after protests broke out of those ICE raids around the city. Joining us now is Elizabeth Goitein. She's a Senior Director of Liberty and National Security at the Brennan Center for Justice and is going to help break down some of the legal arguments we've been hearing from both Donald Trump and opponents over the use of the military in Southern California. And Elizabeth, this hasn't happened for a long time, but it has happened before, a president sending in the National Guard to a state without the governor asking. So to start here, how much historical precedent is there that this White House can point to justify their use of the National Guard here?
Very little. The Army, which includes the federal armed forces, excuse me, but also federalized National Guard forces, have been sent into states and local areas to quell civil unrest very, very rarely in U.S. history. And in general, that's happened under two circumstances. First, where state and local authorities are so completely overwhelmed that they come to the federal government and they ask for help. And then in the second scenario, which we saw a lot of in the civil rights era, the state and local authorities were, if in the event that there was violence happening, which was often violence being perpetrated against civil rights marchers or African Americans trying to attend school, the state and local law enforcement were just kind of sitting on their hands and doing nothing. And in other cases, state authorities were actively obstructing and, acting in defiance of federal court orders. So those are the scenarios where we have seen the military deployed into states in the past. And needless to say, we are in none of those circumstances here.
Yeah. And the president has notably not invoked the Insurrection Act. He's teased it plenty of times. But what do you make of that?
Well, it's hard to say exactly why he hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act, and he's relying on these other authorities. These are obscure legal authorities, including a law that has never been used on its own to quell civil unrest before. And then the other authority is a claim of inherent constitutional power, which has not been tested in the courts. So on the one hand, he is at least claiming that these troops will be able to do things like engage in temporary detentions of people that are some of the same kinds of things that could be done under the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a known quantity. People have heard of it. It's become almost notorious in recent years. People understand the potential for abuse. The authorities that he's relying on are things people haven't heard about. It's not as immediately obvious to them that this is an abuse of the law because they aren't familiar with the laws. So, hard to get into the president's head on this one, but those are some of the relevant sort of facts about those authorities.
Yeah, and we've heard from some notable blue state governors who are on Capitol Hill today, as well as local and state officials in California, with the message being that, yes, this is happening here in the state of California, but it could happen anywhere. It could happen to a blue state, a red state. How real of a concern do you think that is, that we've heard from Democrats, this idea that this is in some ways a test case for how much President Trump can expand his federal authority over states going forward?
Well, if you look at the president's memorandum authorizing deployment, it's not limited to Los Angeles. In fact, it doesn't even mention Los Angeles. The president has authorized deployment of federal forces anywhere in the country where there are protests against ICE activity, regardless of whether those protests involve any violence or lawbreaking. or anywhere where protests are likely to occur. So this is not a deployment that is targeted to situations where there's violence, let alone violence that state and local law enforcement cannot handle. This is a preemptive, nationwide deployment for the purpose of effectively policing protests. And that is something we have never seen in this country. That's not something that happens in the United States of America. That happens in dictatorships and authoritarian regimes.
And I'm wondering, how much does the actual sort of objectives of what the administration says that these troops are on the ground for, you know, for instance, Trump saying that, hey, they're just there to protect federal buildings and maybe help out with ICE. And then we've learned that, yeah, maybe they're detaining some folks and handing them over to local police. How much does what they are actually doing on the ground matter from a legal standpoint?
It matters quite a bit, because if they are engaging in core law enforcement activities such as detaining people, which I don't think has happened yet, but that really triggers this law, the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a law that prohibits federal armed forces from engaging directly in those sorts of law enforcement activities unless expressly authorized by Congress or by the Constitution. So it really does matter. And in terms of the legal authority to use troops to protect federal property and functions, we have an idea of how broadly the administration construes this protection of federal property idea from Portland in 2020, when federal law enforcement officers, not military officers, were sent to Portland when there were demonstrations after the police killing of George Floyd. And those officers were there under a legal authority in which they were only able to protect federal property. And they were still pulling people off of the streets into unmarked vans and arresting them blocks away from any actual federal property. So even though the actual legal justification or the stated purpose of the deployment might seem quite narrow, we have reason to believe that it is being interpreted very broadly.
All right, Elizabeth Goitein with the Brennan Center. Thank you for giving us some legal context about everything that we've seen going on in California over the past week or so. Appreciate your time.